they updated their announcement. All right. So yesterday, Ankur went over attaching the Django backend to a React front end using the Wines API. And today, so pretty much yesterday, we did the full stack development. And today we're going to kind of continue build upon that by doing authentication using React and Django as the backend. There's a little bit more involved with it, but we're going to use a specific type of authentication using JSON web tokens, and we'll kind of get into that. But essentially, after today, all the material will have been taught that will allow you to build a full stack application like user login, authentication, everything. Tomorrow's lecture, Ankur is going to go over some Django REST framework. Essentially, we'll just introduce additional tools to make your life a little bit easier. But you've already been doing it. He's just going to introduce a new way of doing it that might be less code and just might make things a little bit easier. But after today, you'll know, I don't want to say you'll know, but you will have been taught everything you need to complete your personal project, complete group projects, and everything. So now it's just executing practice, practice, practice. But yeah. Any questions?
For the personal projects, I don't know if someone already spoke about this, but is there like a good source of free APIs? Looking through a lot of any of them. Did we already put that up somewhere?
I think I may have linked something that students have used in the past, but there should be, I thought GitHub had one, like GitHub, a list of free APIs. So I guess these are all public APIs. Random cat. So like random pictures of random cats. So here's an API. So yeah, so this is a good resource. But I'll also Slack out a spreadsheet of other APIs that students have used in the past. So like if you want to build like a Major League Baseball app, you can use like Major League Baseball, MLB's API to do data analysis and just show whatever you want. So there's like a bunch of stuff on here. So definitely recommend using this. Sorry, go ahead.
If I use two different Google APIs, is that good enough for two?
Yep. Yep. There are two separate APIs. They're just both happen to come from Google. Yep. All right. And Ankur and I will be going over assessment 5. Will actually be, I don't want to say releasing, but like showing the like what the official requirements are. But we kind of already alluded to like 2 third-party APIs, Postgres database to be able to create, read, update, delete, a couple of resources, just depending on how you want the functionality of your app. And we also highly encourage the like creating a user, that's part of the CRUD, logging in, that's kind of like the reading. So definitely I would encourage like user authentication of creating users, etc.
Well, I've got a question, Tom. Sorry.
Yep. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you think of like a list of challenges that you think would be easiest to approach with like using all of these features from, you know, easiest to probably the most difficult stretch goals?
Easiest to most difficult. I'd say easiest is just doing CRUD, just basic CRUD like how we've been doing. And then probably connecting to a third-party API and reading and writing that data from a backend, and then getting that data to display in a specific components on the front end. And then probably the hardest is, I think a lot of students get caught up in user authentication, kind of like what we're going to kind of cover today. But I'd say that's probably the most difficult I see students. So if you, yeah, a lot of the challenges come from, you have the data that you want on the back end and you have it displayed in JSON on the back end. It's getting that data to render in components on the front end. That is the biggest challenge that students have, just because it's the most kind of what we've just started going over. So it's still relatively fresh. So I'd say that's probably the most challenging in addition to user authentication.
Okay, awesome. Thank you very much. Didn't mean to interrupt. Thanks.
Oh, no, no, yeah, good questions. All right, anybody else? All right, so what we're gonna do today, we're gonna build a simple app that allows a user to log in and log out. And also, I would say remained login. So if a user refreshes, they're still logged in. So what I'm gonna do is open up a new VS Code window and create a new challenge or a new directory.
I take it we aren't using local storage anymore?
No, we can see we are still using local storage. You can also use session storage, but we really don't go over that. It's just how we retrieve the data from the back end. Essentially, when we log in, what gets returned, and yeah. So what I'm going to do is make a directory called Django React JWT, and JWT stands for Java JSON Web Token, and we'll kind of go over kind of what that is once we actually get to it. All right, so we're going to create two apps, or we're going to create a Django backend and a React frontend. But right now, we're just going to start with creating a Django backend. So what's the first thing? Actually, what should I do? I'm going to create a Django project. I'm going to actually create a new directory just called backend, just to keep things simple. Backend, list everything out. There's nothing in there. And I'm going to create a new Django project. But what's the first thing I need to do to create a new Django project?
Create a virtual environment.
Yep, Python-make venv. I'm going to source into that virtual environment or activate it. So activate that virtual environment. Great. I'm going to install 5 different libraries. I'm going to pip install Django, which we should be pretty familiar with. Cycob G2, Django REST framework. I think we introduced Django REST framework on Friday. I'm going to also introduce Django REST framework dash JavaScript web token or JSON web token, and also Django cores. And so we're going to be using Django REST framework to do serializers and creating view methods. Also, we're using Django REST framework JWT to retrieve a JSON web token that will essentially authenticate a user. And then we're using Django cores headers that will allow our backend to communicate with our front end. All right, so I'm gonna list everything out. I've got my virtual environment. I'm gonna clear the terminal. Can everyone see? Is this big enough or should I zoom in? Is it good?
It's good.
So now I'm gonna actually start a new Django project. It's Django admin start project. I'm gonna call it backend. Yeah, I'm just gonna call it backend. And I don't want it to be nested. So I'm gonna list everything out. So we've got our backend Django project, our manage.py, and yeah. And I'm gonna actually go up one level, and I'm going to code-r and open this into a new VS Code window. I might have to go back into my virtual environment because I reloaded everything, but that's okay. So I've got my backend, and I've got my backend Django project. Because in this directory, I'm gonna also create my React frontend. So I'm gonna do backend, list everything out, source venv, then activate to go back into my virtual environment. There we go. All right. So inside of my backend, inside of my settings directory, or I'm sorry, my settings file, I'm just gonna get rid of the comment out. I'm going to add to my installed apps the REST framework. We're going to be utilizing Django REST framework. And I'm going to be also using CORS headers. And we're going to be adding more stuff to this, but for right now, these the two apps I'm going to be installed as well. And there's also something else I'm going to install. I'm going to install CORS headers middleware, and that needs to come above this common middleware. So this CORS middleware needs to come above this Django, this common middleware. And last, we need to tell the Django project what type of authentication we want and what kind of permissions we want to require for this application. So I'm just going to copy some code right there. So we're using the REST framework. So the default permissions classes, we're going to want everything for users to be authenticated. So this permissions is authenticated essentially says, hey, we want anytime we make post requests or anything, we want to check to see whether or not the user is authenticated. So that's what the default permissions is. And the default authentication, it's like, what's the default authentication type we want to authenticate the user with? And it goes in, I believe, descending order. So first, they're going to look for a JSON web token authentication. That's what we're going to be using today. If not that, they're going to use session authentication. And then if not that, just basic authentication. But we're going to go over JSON web token authentication today. And last, what do we need to add in order for our backend to communicate with a React front end? Go ahead.
A whitelist.
Yep, exactly. So we're going to be creating a React front end. So we're going to have to add our local host. So, and what's the local host for React?
I believe it's 3000.
Yep. So we've got localhost 3000. We're doing HTTPS and HTTP just to cover all our bases. So what I just did, I installed Django, Cyclops G2, because we're going to be using a Postgres database, Django REST framework, Java JSON web token, and then CORS headers. And then we added this CORS middleware in front of this common middleware. And then we added this entire REST framework section to our settings file that says, hey, what are the default permissions in order for a user to interact with our web application? And the permission is using the REST framework's permissions is authenticated. So we have to make sure that the users are authenticated. And also, what type of authentication will we be using? There's JSON web token, and there's also session authentication. So
You'd think there would be a command to do all of that.
yeah, yes, I don't know. All right. So next, what we need to do is go to our URLs within our project, our Django project. And we're gonna, from the REST framework, .jwt. So from the JavaScript or JSON web token REST framework, they've got built-in views. We're going to import a specific view method from the the REST framework JWT library. And this view or this view function is called obtain JWT token. So this specific view is really a method that's going to return a web token. All right. So I'm down here. And anytime I go to token auth, so token authorization or authentication, I want to run obtain JWT token. See if this works. All right. So, and all right. So that's all, that's the first thing we need to do. And now we're just going to go ahead and actually, let's put a comma there or forward slash. Let's go ahead and migrate everything. Python manage.py migrate. So we haven't created any models, so we don't need to make migrations. We haven't created a separate Django app. This is all contained within our Django project. So I migrated all the built-in migration scripts. Now I'm going to create a super user. Python manage.py, create super user. You should be pretty familiar with this right now. So leave it blank, tom@email.com. Password 123, 123. That's too short. That's fine. All right. So now I'm going to run this Django project, and I'm going to go to token auth and see what shows up. I'm going to Python manage.py run server. All right. Let's come over. Let's bring over a new tab. And go to localhost 8000. Do token auth. And so we've got this interface from the Django REST framework that allows us to obtain a Java or JSON web token. So this API view that receives posts with a user's username and password returns a JSON web token that can be used for authenticating requests or authenticated requests. So I went to token, it was a GET request, method not allowed. I'm going to type in my super user, ta-preet 123. And if I do post, so this is going to make a post request to the obtain JSON web token resource. And now look what I get back. I get this long mix of characters and numbers. And this is what a JSON web token is. So in the past, there's a couple ways to authenticate users. There's session authentication and then JSON web token. In the past, session authentication, essentially what you would have to do is store like a token similar to this, but not necessarily this. Like it just looks like this, and the application would have to store that somewhere on the back end, whether it's in a database, in memory, but all the heavy lifting is done on the server. So they would have to store this token on the server. Where JSON web token comes in, this is presented to the user's front end, and then the browser stores this in the browser somewhere. So we're not storing anything in the database for a session like in the past. JSON web token, things are stored on the server or on the browser. And again, this is a JSON web token, and these numbers and characters, this whole mix of this big string, this is actually means something. So if I go to JWT.io, so that string is broken up into 3 different parts: headers, payload, and a signature. So the first part, so if I come over here and put that in there, so this is what's actually returned from this. That's that entire string. And notice how there's a period there, and there's another period here as well. So it's broken off into essentially like 3 separate strings. The first string is the headers, which essentially says, hey, what hashing algorithm should I use for this JSON web token? The second string right here is the actual payload of what's being returned. And this last part is the signature, which is actually a combination of both of these, and it's like all hashed together. So notice I put that in here. This red is the hashing algorithm. When it's decoded, this is the type. It's a type, it's a JSON web token. The algorithm, it's HS256. It's a hashing algorithm. The purple, that's the actual payload that's being returned. And notice what's being returned: user ID. So this is the first user in the database, user ID of 1. My username is TA_preet. When the token actually expires, and this is in milliseconds, I believe. And then the email. So this is all that's being returned from this. And then the last is the signature, which takes in both the header and the payload, and it runs through this function here, this base64 URL encoder. And then also there's like a secret that's being returned. I don't know what that is. And then it hashes that to that. So this is virtually unbreakable, but if I were to change anything in here, like if I were to change that B to a C, this whole thing would break. So it's an invalid signature.
So the last part is basically like a checksum.
Yep, this like essentially checks to make sure this, essentially you can extrapolate. So from this, you can extrapolate both of these. So if any part of this is wrong, then this part would be wrong and they wouldn't match up.
I don't think you can extrapolate it, but I think that the hash hashing the first 2 items will always result in the same hash as the 3rd item, but I don't think you can go the other way.
No, yeah, you can't, if you were to ever break it, you would be able to get it, but these are almost, you can't brute force this. That's why it's so secure.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much what a JSON web token is. You don't really need to know all that, but that's just if you want to know like the history of why that is. And there are different other hashing algorithms. There's like RS256. There's a couple more. So this is what's being returned right here. But maybe when you log in, you also want to get some additional information. Like maybe you want to not just return the token, but you actually want to return the username, the ID. I don't know if you remember in news site, when you would log in, it would return like the user ID, some token and other stuff. So this right here is just returning the token, but maybe we're going to want to return the user ID and some other information. And maybe the username, maybe the email, etc. What questions do you have about this part so far? All right.
So when you're setting that up with the expiration time, as far as say you sign into a website and then if they use the JSON web token, does it automatically time out for how long you can use that token and need to sign in again?
Yeah, it depends on how the website or the application is set up. I think this one's set up for like 5 minutes or something, but you can change that. But certain applications will make you log in after a certain amount of time. It's usually not 5 minutes. It might be 30 days, 60 days, 6 months. And you can, in our app, you can customize when you want it to expire. It's just like another settings in here. But yeah, you can change when it expires. Is that your question? Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you.
Yep. All right. So great, we're able to get our token back, but let's actually create the ability for a user to continue coming back. And so when you do a hard refresh, it's able to get that current user. Also, let's when we sign up or log in, let's also just have it return, the username and ID back instead of just the token. It'll have the token in addition to a user ID and username. So with that, we're going to actually have to create a Django app now. So I'm going to create a separate Python manage.py start app. I'm just going to call it core. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it user information, but for this tutorial, we're just going to call it core. And now in our settings, which we're in right now, let's go ahead and add core to our installed apps. And here we are in our backend, and here is our core Django app. So in here, what file do we need to create in order to return something in JSON?
Serializers.
Serializer?
Yep. So we're going to have to create a serializers.py file. All right, like so. Close that. And in here, we're going to have to, from the REST framework, and this is all going to be using the Django REST framework, Django JWT, or the REST framework JWT, and the built-in Django user model. So we're going to import serializers from REST framework _JWT. We're going to import the settings, import API settings, and we're also going to from Django contrib auth models import the built-in user model. And so when we log in and there's already a current user that's already logged in and I refresh, I want to be able to serialize that user and send it to the front end as JSON. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy some code over here just for simple purposes. I'm going to create, so this is going to serialize a current user. So I'm creating a class user serializer, which inherits the model serializer from the REST framework's serializers module. And in here, we've got, again, this class meta. The model we're going to be serializing is the user model. And we want to send back, let's say, the username, ID, and let's also just send back the email as well. So if I go ahead and do that, let's see, does that work yet? Probably not. Let's actually see something. So if I do Python manage.py or manage.py run server, I don't know if this is going to work yet, but let's just see if this works. If I go ahead and refresh this, no, it still didn't work, not yet. Yeah. So what I'm going to have to do is add onto our app, but it's going to serialize this user because I'm going to have to send this through a view method. And then it's going to run this user serializer and output from the view method. All right, so we've got this user serializer. And so let's go ahead and then create some views. And this is where things kind of get a little tricky. All right. The first thing I'm gonna import a bunch of stuff. I'm just gonna copy and paste it in here. So I'm importing HTTP response redirect. I'm importing the built-in user model. Importing the REST framework, the permissions and status. I'm importing a REST framework decorator called API view. So this decorator takes in a list of HTTP responses and, or I'm sorry, HTTP methods, and will essentially only run that view method when it corresponds to a specific HTTP method. I'm using the response from the REST framework and this API view as well. And I'm also importing the user serializer as well. So this API view decorator only runs when we do GET requests. We can do def current user, takes in the request, and serializer equals, we're going to run the user serializer, and we're passing in the request.user. And then we just return the response with the serializer data. So this gets the current user based on the user token. So if there's already a user logged in, I'm going to send the token back in the response, or I'm sorry, I'm going to send the token in the request, and it's going to find the current user. If the current user is logged in, it's going to return that user. The next one is going to be able to handle new users, so new user signups. So yeah, let's just kind of show you what that.
So for that current user request, the token gets thrown in by the browser because we don't know what it is.
Yeah, so we're going to store that the token in the browser, and then when we're going to probably store it in local storage, and then when we log in, and if we like do a hard refresh in our front end React, it's going to always send a response to check to see if there's a current logged in user, and we're going to send that token in the request in the headers where it's like authorization, and we do the token, we pass the token in the request. And this user list creates a new user. It's called user list because normally we'd have a get method here too for retrieving a list of all users. But this one is specifically for creating a user. So this is where we're using allow any permissions. We're going to have to use a user serializer with token. So I need to create another serializer method, which is a lot more. So this serializes a new user sign up that responds with a new user's information, including a token. So when I sign up a new user, it responds with that user information as well as the token. Let's import that up here. Like so. So this is what's being creating a user. We're retrieving the password from the form. We're setting that password on that instance, and then we're saving the instance here. Then we're returning the user with the token, username, and password. All right. So let's go back to our backend and back to our URLs. And we're going to have to include the core. So token use core. And in here, we're going to have to also include the core, the app cores.urls file. And then in the core app, we're gonna have to create a URLs file, urls.py. And this only takes in 2 URLs, the current user, as well as a user list or the users. This is for the post request when we're actually signing up a user. So when we go to core/current user, it comes into the views, grabs the current user with that token passed in, comes into the user serializer, grabs that user, serializes it, and returns the token with the user ID and everything. When we do a post request to users, we're using the user list right here as view. And then this is for new signups. Uh-oh, something happened. Yeah, okay. All right.
What does as view do again?
It just says use this user class as a view method. So it's like a shorthand to create a
So
view.
it just runs everything it can find inside the class?
It depending on what post. So if I do a post request to users, if this is a view, it'll come into here, look for a method called post and run that. If I run a get method to user list as view, it'll come into here and look for a method called get, but we don't have one. So yeah. So it runs specific methods as a view. And the very last thing we need to do is in our backend on the same level as our settings.py file, we're going to create a utils file.py. Is that what I need to do? Yep. And I'm just gonna, this utils, I'm gonna paste this in here. And this just says, instead of just responding with the token, we also want to respond when a user signs up, or I'm sorry, when a user logs in, we want it to respond not just with the token, but with the user, runs the user serializer right here. So it's actually going to respond with the token and the user, and it's going to respond this user serializer. It's going to respond with whatever is in our serializers right here. So user serializer, it should respond with our username, ID, and email address.
Is this the first time we're using utils.py?
Yes. So this utils.py essentially just says, instead of responding with just the token, also add a user key on it with the user's username, ID, and email. This is the first time we're using the utils. And lastly, in our settings.py file, we need to add, instead of REST, cores middleware. Whenever we do have a user login, this JSON response payload handler. So what do we actually want to send back to the front end? or as JSON, run the backend utils my JWT response handler. So run that method, which is this method right here. So if everything worked, if I clear manage.py, run server, there we go. If I were to do like a hard refresh, notice how I get this username, ID, and email back. And if I do token auth, and I do GA-preet, 3, I get that back. What questions do you have about user authentication with the backend? So now, sorry, go ahead. So now if I go to, I don't think this will work, but if I go to core/current user, I get authentication credentials were not provided because I'm trying to get the current user, but in my GET request, in my headers, request headers. So here's all the request headers. I'm not adding that token in here because I'll need to add the authorization in the headers with that token stored in the headers. Or not stored in the headers, but send it back in the headers. What questions do you have? Anybody?
I'm not sure what my questions are yet.
So the serializer just gets the current user if a user is always already logged in. This user serializer with token, when you sign up, this creates a new web token and also sends it back with the user name and password to the front end. So once you create a new user, it'll send that token back with the newly created user and everything. All right, let's see if this works. Content user, I've never done this before. I think this is this raw. Let's do, or actually, A, B, C, D, E, F, 1, 2, 3. There we go. So I just created a new user through this, the users, and notice how what's being sent back is the token and my username.
And we see that the test setup is using a constant for the token.
I'm sorry?
Looks like the test setup's using a constant for the token. It's not changing much.
So this token isn't changing much. So if I come over here and do JW, so it is changing. So you can see user ID is now 2. The
Yeah,
username.
it's the first section just starts out the same because it's still Tom.
Oh, yeah. And I think this is always going to be the same because it uses the same hashing algorithm. With that, we'll go ahead and, all right. So we created the back end. We're able to create a user that receive or that returns a JSON web token. We're able to log in an already existing user that returns a token as well as the user information. Now we're going to create a front end React app and connect both of them together. So I've got my back end. Let's go ahead and npx create React app. Let's just call it front end. Keep it simple. So it's creating a new React app. And we're going to keep this super basic, super simple. It's just going to have a home page, a login page, a sign up page, and I think that's it. Home page, login page, and a sign up page. Keep it super simple.